나 줄리 뽑았다! 나도 산다면 산다 이거야. 예쁘다고 소문났죠? 와, 넓다 넓어. 빵빵해서 좋다. 출발! 부릉부릉부릉부릉 부릉. 와, 로미오다.
Well, from that intro, it seems some people were very happy with their Daewoo's. At the end of the 20th century, it looked like the future belonged to Asia. Japanese electronics were second to none, as were their cars, and Korea wasn't far behind. And one bright star was Daewoo. Founded in 1967, in just 30 years it was Korea's second largest company. A meteoric rise then, but today its name has all but disappeared. Why did Daewoo decide to make cars? What's its connection with General Motors? And what became of it? This is the Daewoo story. The Daewoo story starts in 1937 with the founding of National Motors. With the Korean government wanting more local car production, they banned the import of fully assembled cars in 1962, and National Motors, now renamed as Sayonara Motors, worked with Nissan to import knockdown kits of the Bluebird 310 for final assembly. But with a shortage of foreign currency, only 2,700 odd cars were made and Sayonara Motors collapsed. Rival Shinjin Motors took over Bluebird production and the two companies eventually merged. The next step was an agreement with Mitsubishi to build the Colt from knockdown kits, but at this point the government wanted more than just local assembly. They wanted parts produced locally to stimulate Korean manufacturing. The Mitsubishi Colt deal wasn't what they wanted, so it was terminated after just a year. Shinjin rolled with the punches and soon had an agreement with Toyota to make the Corona, manufacturing 21% locally, and the deal was that Toyota would take a stake in the company. Shinjin Motors had a government-sanctioned monopoly to produce cars, and understandably competitors wanted this to change. This would lead to industrial giant Hyundai switching to car production in 1967, producing the Pony that I talk about more in the video linked above. Another thing that happened in 1967 was the founding of Daewoo, a word that means great universe, but the Woo in Daewoo references founder Kim Woo-chung, probably a name I've got wrong, but anyway, we'll go with it. With Dai meaning great, it's as if the company name was basically calling him a great man. It's a bit like Tesla being named Awesome Elon. Kim Woo-chung got his start in the textiles industry, and that's where Daewoo would begin. Shinjin Motors and Toyota had a good thing going, but Toyota had eyes for someone else. They wanted to start producing cars in China, but Chinese law demanded that companies operating there couldn't have ownership in Korean companies. Probably with the words, "It's not me, it's you," Toyota put their stake in Shinjin Motors up for sale in 1972, and Shinjin soon found a new partner in American giant General Motors. The new joint venture, half owned by Shinjin and half by GM, would be known as GM Korea. Shinjin would get another partner in 1974, setting up a joint venture with GM's rival AMC to produce Jeeps. Shinjin would continue making Jeeps into the 1980s, but this operation would be spun off into a separate entity that would eventually become Sangyon Motors. The main goal of the GM Korea joint venture was to assemble GM vehicles in Korea, as Shinjin hadn't yet developed the skills to design and produce cars of their own. The first was the Chevrolet 1700, a rebadged Australian Holden Torana. It would be joined by the Opel Rekord in 1973 and the Isuzu Gemini in 1977, itself based on the Opel Kadett. Koreans didn't warm to these cars, especially with the high fuel prices induced by the 1973 oil crisis. Sales were slow, GM weren't happy with Shinjin's management, and the whole joint venture floundered. Shinjin sold its stake in 1976 to the Korean Development Bank, who in turn sold it in 1978 to the Great Universe company, Daewoo. At this point, Daewoo were growing in leaps and bounds, moving into areas such as shipbuilding under pressure from the government. They had a knack for turning around failing businesses. Whatever Daewoo touched turned to gold, and it would go on to make machine tools, military hardware, semiconductors, even aeroplanes and helicopters, all assisted by cheap government loans. Maybe they could do the same with a new GM joint venture. In 1983, the General Motors Daewoo joint venture was renamed from GM Korea to the Daewoo Motor Company, but this was still very much a GM operation, producing updated versions of existing Opel vehicles such as the Le Mans based on the Opel Kadett. But it wasn't only GM vehicles. Daewoo branched out by producing a version of the Nissan Vanette. Sales grew as Korea's economy blossomed. Korean competitor Hyundai have been dabbling with designing and producing their own cars since the 1970s, so it was natural that rising star Daewoo would test the waters with their own car, but they would start with baby steps. The 1990 Daewoo Esprit was based on the Opel Kadett and used a GM engine from Australian subsidiary Holden. The body was all new though by Italian coach builder Bertoni. Apparently it was originally designed to be the shape of the second generation Citroën BX. It would take on the new Hyundai Sonata, itself based on the Ford Cortina platform, which was originally supposedly created to take on the Daewoo Royale. Daewoo kept growing with fingers in many different pies. Daewoo Heavy Industries, nothing to do with the Daewoo Motors GM partnership, produced the Damas minivan and Labo pickup, both rebadged versions of the Suzuki Carry. They'd also modified the Suzuki Alto to produce their own city car, the 1991 Daewoo Tico, that would be sold alongside cars from the GM partnership in Daewoo showrooms. So Daewoo had a partnership with GM, they produced a Nissan van, they were working with Suzuki, they'd started designing their own cars, and in 1991 the new Daewoo Motors sales division would import and sell vehicles from Mitsubishi. Clearly Daewoo had bigger dreams than just being a General Motors satellite operation. They wanted to sell their own cars in the USA. GM understandably wasn't very keen, so the two firms parted ways, leaving the Daewoo Motor Company as an independent company, still of course heavily reliant on producing GM vehicles. But that had to change, so Daewoo Motors put in place a four-pronged strategy. The first was to do a deal with Honda to import the Legend and sell it as the Daewoo Arcadia. The second was to begin exporting its existing cars. The Esprit started a world tour, starting with Brazil in 1994, then Australia and Europe in 1995, where it would go up against the Ford Mondeo and brand new Vectra from old partner General Motors. And that's where Daewoo got a cold dose of reality. The Esprit was based on 1980s technology and it felt like it. It would be sold at a discount and include a long warranty to soothe worries that Daewoo's weren't clunkers that would fall apart if you so much as looked at them in a funny way.
Servicing, parts and labour, and AA cover. All thrown in for nothing? That'll be the Daewoo.
The third part in Daewoo's plan was to start production in other countries. Daewoo could save on delivery costs by making cars closer to Europe. Cheap labour could be found in the new East European democracies, so Tico production expanded to Poland, Uzbekistan and Romania. The fourth part of the strategy was new models. Daewoo would excite with a flurry of concept designs in the mid-90s created by the Italian styling houses. This wasn't all show and no substance though. Work was underway to develop the new Bira in the UK and Germany under the direction of Ulrich Bez, fresh from his time designing cars for Porsche and BMW. It would be joined by the Lanos, which would again use the Opel Kadett platform and would be developed with the help of GM subsidiaries such as AC Rochester, Delco and GM Powertrain, with additional help from Porsche. Safety tests would be carried out in the UK with brake testing in Austria. These cars would be joined by the next generation Esprit, the Leganza and a Tico restyle called the Matiz. Daewoo didn't have the expertise to design cars themselves, so they were relying on outside partners. As rival Hyundai found out in the 1970s with the Pony, making your own car from scratch is hard, and incremental steps were the best way to transform from a vehicle assembler to a fully fledged car company. Daewoo had come a long way. They'd started by assembling knockdown kits from Japan, but by the late 1990s they were producing their own cars in Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Vietnam, India and Egypt. Daewoo were treading the path that many developing nations had taken to develop their car industries, and they'd shaken off corporate overlords General Motors in the process. It all looked rosy, at least on the surface, but behind the glossy car photos, Daewoo was in trouble. They'd spent big to create their own range of cars and had expanded rapidly. The 1997 Asian financial crisis weakened exchange rates and the Korean economy suffered. While other companies reined in spending to weather the storm, Daewoo hit the accelerator. They acquired SsangYong Motors in 1998. Their relationship with the Korean government went south. Access to cheap credit disappeared, leaving Daewoo with large debts and fewer sales. In 2000, Daewoo, the second largest conglomerate in Korea, went bankrupt with debts of around £65 billion. And you don't need to convert that to today's prices and your own currency to know that that's a lot of money. Fearing jail time, Daewoo's leader, Kim Woo-chong, who'd given the great company its name, did a runner and fled to Vietnam. Prosecutors charged Daewoo's management with accounting fraud. Kim Woo-chung would remain in Vietnam until 2005, when he returned to Korea and then was immediately arrested for embezzlement and accounting fraud. His entire £18 billion fortune was seized and he was sentenced to 10 years behind bars. The Daewoo empire was in tatters, and if it were liquidated it would cripple the Korean economy. After all, Daewoo and its contractors employed 2.5 million people in Korea. The government stepped in to keep it running while they found buyers for each part of the business. The big question was, who would buy Daewoo Motors? Ford took a look but turned it down. They felt it was too hard to turn around. The for sale sign hung outside Daewoo's headquarters for 2 years until its old estranged partner GM agreed to buy a controlling stake in the ailing car division with the help of Suzuki and Chinese company SAIC, renaming it GM Daewoo. Indian Tata Motors would buy Daewoo's truck division. For GM, this was a good deal. They got the best parts of Daewoo Motors for a fire sale price, and it allowed them to get a footing in the growing Asian market where they were sorely lacking. Daewoo even had new models it had produced through the financial turmoil. The Magnus had replaced the Leganza in 2000, and they launched the new Takuma MPV. There were 2 new cars waiting in the wings as well, the Carlos to replace the Lanos, and the Lacetti would replace the new Bira. GM would launch them as low-cost world cars. The Kalos and Lacetti would become Chevrolets, Holdens, Pontiacs, Ravons, Zazes and Suzukis, and would be produced and sold around the world. But in Europe, the old Daewoo cars hadn't received much of a warm welcome. They were seen as underpowered and unrefined. The new cars didn't fare much better. Rebadged models ended up hurting Suzuki's reputation in the USA and contributed to their exit in 2012. But cheap economical cars were a useful commodity to General Motors in their home market. Large SUVs were in high demand, but the US government required car makers to have a certain average fuel economy across its range, so the Daewoo Kalos would be rebadged as the Chevrolet Aveo and sold in dealers across America. It also allowed GM to sell an entry-level car at an entry-level price, so fending off cars that were undercutting them, like from Korean competitor Hyundai. Daewoo's cars hadn't troubled mainstream manufacturers in Europe, and the Daewoo name wasn't held in much regard. GM wanted to increase Daewoo's sales and sell its North American vehicles, such as the Corvette, that were now being designed with worldwide sales in mind. So in 2005, all Daewoo's were rebranded as Chevrolets in Europe. North American cars would take a while to arrive. The Chevrolet HHR appeared in 2008, and it would take another 3 years for the Corvette to turn up. But the quality of Daewoo's cars hadn't improved much, so rather than improving the car's image with a rebrand, it merely diminished the Chevrolet name. Would customers want to buy a Corvette that had the same badge as a tinny tiny Spark? Daewoo's implosion had hindered sales, so it can't have helped when their parent filed for bankruptcy in 2009. General Motors were forced to sell parts of its business, but it decided to keep its Korean operation. It still held true that having Asian factories helped them sell cars globally, and GM had a promising business selling cars in China thanks to the much-loved Buick brand. The Daewoo name was still used for cars sold in Korea, but this came to an end in 2011. After all, the Daewoo brand was still in use for some of the old subsidiaries from the 1990s, so it didn't make sense to use a brand that had bad memories and could have conflicts with other companies, especially when GM had more brand names than it knew what to do with after the 2008 bankruptcy. GM Daewoo was renamed GM Korea as it had been in the 1970s. Since then, things haven't improved. Cars from GM Korea exited the European market in 2015 due to poor sales. Although General Motors still had a need for Korean production, sales of Korean-made cars ended in the US in 2022 when the Chevrolet Spark ended production. With GM's rush to electrify, it now has more than enough fuel-efficient cars to offset its gas-guzzling SUVs, and unlike Daewoo's, they don't have to be discounted to help them sell. Daewoo's rise mirrored the sharp rise in Korean living standards from the 1970s, and it was perhaps the highest profile casualty in the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s. Despite pumping money into development in the 1990s, the cars were still not good enough to compete with the best in the world, a problem that GM took too long to rectify thanks to financial problems of their own. While rival Hyundai also had economic problems in the late 1990s, it weathered the storm and took a slow but steady approach to improving the quality of their cars to a point that it's becoming a force to be reckoned with. That's a place that Daewoo hoped to attain, but like the tortoise and the hare, slow and steady wins the race. Daewoo's story might not have ended well, but although Škoda had an equally bumpy ride, it turned out much better. See the full story about it on the right. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.